The lawmen and the men who helped build America weren't always as clean as history likes to depict them. They were men who battled addictions and demons. Often, they were suffering from withdrawal from morphine. This substance was everywhere and touted as a harmless cure. It may have removed the pain, but it created something far deadlier. In this frontier mystery, we'll look at the pioneers who couldn't go a day without morphine. And if you're interested in our content, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications. Not every cowboy was clean. When you think of a lawman who cleaned up the Old West, what do you think? Chances are, a clean-shaven man of the law who's as straight-laced as his shots. If he does any substances at all, it's a shot of whiskey at the saloon after a day's work. But this isn't the case. And it wasn't their fault. Many of these substances were given out as a sort of quick-fix solution. And many of these lawmen needed something to take the edge off. It was there, and these guys could easily afford it, given that they made the money. When some of them stopped the bad guys, whether it was a train robbery or a saloon shoot-up, substances might take hold. Oftentimes, these addictions weren't even noticed by the cowboys, because it was just another day, and it was how they got by. Next, we will look at how they got a hold of these substances, creating the addictions and demons that became next to impossible for some to give up. How addiction took hold. In our last video, we looked at laudanum addiction in women. This concoction often contained other ingredients, including morphine. Please watch that video later, after this one, if you haven't already. But to summarize, it was commonly used by many women. But not only that, but laudanum was given to babies to soothe crying and other issues. So from the cradle, many men developed an addiction, not by choice. They would take this for similar reasons. Maybe pain. Maybe they had a long day of tackling the West's worst criminals and needed something to take the edge off. However, addiction came through another way: war. The smoke from the Civil War was just dissipating, but the wounds that many men experienced during this time never went away. For the men may have gone on to live everyday lives, but addiction followed. Traumatic events and stress from fighting played a key role, creating the lion's share of addiction in many men. The lawmen, the railroad builders, even the train robbers, they helped shape America into what it is today. And yet, they were all battling a common enemy: addiction. It didn't matter how much grit you had back in the day. The biology of addiction was the same as it was back then, and the horrors of war may lead you down a dark path. The horrors of the Civil War. In the Civil War, sometimes the ones who died were the lucky ones. Over 476,000 soldiers in this war were wounded, and this is just an estimate. During this time, the war wasn't fought with bullets that would go clean through you too. Instead, the soldiers were hit with .58 caliber mini balls. If one hit you, even in a non-lethal area, it was a horrifying experience. The ball would shatter the bone or send debris flying into your tissue. Often your arm or leg would become mangled, and with surgery not being as advanced as it was now, there was only one solution: amputation. During the Civil War, it was said that there were 60,000 amputations total. If you went in for surgery, there was a 75% chance that your arm or leg was coming clean off. To these soldiers, the doctors cutting off their limbs were like butchers, seeing their patients as mere meat wanting to be chopped. However, the doctors were doing the best they could. There were many, many wounded soldiers, and often the best course of action was a clean amputation to ensure survival. Still, for many of these soldiers, the wounds of war left behind phantom pains, not just from their limbs, but from their injuries. Even if you were wounded in battle and didn't lose an arm or leg, there may be shrapnel embedded in you for a lifetime, or wounds that never fully healed, leading to a lifetime of pain. Until pensions were invented, you may have lost your job or become destitute, and you may turn to the substance that your doctor injected into you during surgery or took to numb the pain: morphine. Since medicine was nowhere near as advanced as it is today, when you got your leg amputated or worked on, it really hurt. That pain didn't go away either. Oftentimes, that excruciating pain from the shrapnel, mangled legs, or even phantom pains became next to impossible to ignore. Morphine is incredibly good at removing pain. It would dull all of that, which was what these guys needed. Because the alternative, that excruciating pain, made it almost worse than the injury itself. For decades, many former soldiers were addicted to morphine in the 1870s and beyond. One example was the story of John Tackett Gulrick. He was a Confederate veteran who was wounded in battle in 1864 and prescribed morphine. After the war, he became a lawyer and tried living with his wife, Frances. However, the monkey on his back kept digging its claws into him. His morphine addiction strained his marriage, made it difficult to practice law, and his health was declining. However, many men like John refused to seek help. In this time, and even still nowadays, men seeking help for addiction were seen as unmanly and a sign of weakness. Eventually, Frances made John withdraw by locking him in a farmhouse room with nurse supervision. This was under the threat of divorce. "I can bear neither for myself nor the children this life any longer. His mind and brain are clouded," she wrote in her letters. Many viewers may be married and have dealt with marital issues before, but imagine your relationship on the rocks like this, where you have to self-commit to keep your wife with you. His story is one that is known, but there are probably other men who also went through similar issues in order to preserve their already rocky marriage. Of course, not everyone had this privilege. Some were committed, others died on the streets, and others kept their addiction hidden until their deaths. This period was known as morphine mania, and many at the time did not understand the addictive nature of morphine or the PTSD that drove soldiers to take something that numbed the pain, even if they weren't injured in battle. Some would refer to the addiction and PTSD experienced by soldiers as the soldier's disease. However, there is a reason why morphine was found in everyday lawmen, and it wasn't just because of the trauma of war. It wasn't just soldiers. Morphine addiction wasn't just for the wounded soldier, the cramping wife, or the fussy baby. It was also for any ailment. See, morphine was very easy to buy. Think of it like aspirin back in the day. You could go to any general store and buy it over the counter. Do you have a headache, diarrhea, coughing? The doctor may have given you morphine. Nowadays, this feels like the equivalent of blowing up a room to kill a fly, but back then, it was the everyday solution. Morphine as a substance also loses its potency at low doses very fast. Take it once or twice to deal with leg pain from being thrown off a horse. Suddenly, that amount doesn't do anything to stop the leg pain, and you have to take more. Those small doses turned into bigger doses, and eventually, addiction. How many were addicted? It could be in the hundreds of thousands, with some saying it was 1 in 200. Due to documentation being poorer and the epidemic not being fully understood, it was hard to say. You may have been a man who was as straight-laced as could be, but if you were experiencing back-breaking work, you may eventually go to the doctor to get a little dose or two. The problem was that morphine in small doses led to much greater doses until finally one took so much that their life was snuffed out prematurely. But for many men, they simply coped, took their morphine, went about their day without any knowledge of such. So how did morphine users end up in the frontier? The addicts head westward. After the Civil War, the U.S. began expanding west, and many citizens headed that way for a fresh start. For many veterans, going westward was a chance to get a new career. Even if wounded, a soldier could still lend a spare limb or two to help build the railroad, homes, or look for gold. In a way, this practice is still done today. Many people move to get away from their past, then are surprised when their past doesn't stay in their old home, but follows them. Going west could provide a new life and career, but not detox or a better way to numb the pain. Some men experienced withdrawals during this point, but they chalked it up to new scenery, new lives, and not something worth worrying about. In some men, there was a bit of momentary detoxing. As things were being built, the morphine was harder to find. But then, pharmacies opened and the cycle began anew. You may have been clean for a good while, but you weren't aware of concepts such as triggers and relapsing. When you saw morphine again, your brain was craving it again, and you would become an addict once more. And many of the men in these Wild West towns weren't breaking the law, but upholding it, the addicted lawmen and their rivals. Let's first talk about the criminals in the Old West. When you think of outlaws, you think of people who had elaborate schemes and heists, people who would not be addicted to any substances. Instead of stealing money to fuel the addiction, they were doing it for other means, such as getting rich quick, or perhaps it was a Robin Hood situation. However, this is a misconception. First, you need to remember that not every addict is someone begging on the street. Many addicts are high-functioning, and some work among us as CEOs and other influential people. But besides that, not all outlaw crime in the Old West was train robberies. Muggings at the saloon, holdups, these were simpler, pettier crimes that were often done by addicts trying to get the next buzz. And the lawmen who stopped them may have been addicted to morphine too. It is hard to say how many Wild West lawmen were addicted to morphine. Again, documentation can be challenging to find, and a lawman may not have wanted to reveal his addiction. This wasn't just to set a bad example, but once again, because doing so would show weakness. The most prominent example is Doc Holliday. Most of us know him as the deputy marshal who served under Virgil Earp, and we discussed his involvement in the shooting at the OK Corral. Check out those videos if you haven't done so already. But Doc Holliday, while he was battling outlaws, was fighting his own addiction. In his early 20s, Doc had tuberculosis, better known as consumption during this time, and he battled it for years. Tuberculosis could lead to massive coughing fits that would lead to pain, and laudanum was the only way that Holliday could relieve that. He also drank a lot of booze to relieve the symptoms. Naturally, since it numbed his pain, he became addicted to both substances. He finally succumbed to the disease at just 36 years old in 1887, and many of us wonder if the morphine addiction didn't stymie his disease, but helped send him to an early grave. Funny enough, the outlaws he battled were morphine addicts as well. Billy Leonard of the Cochise County Cowboys was said to have had an arm scarred with morphine injections. However, by lawmen, it wasn't just the sheriffs, but also the politicians in charge of creating the law. We mentioned in our last video that George Washington was a well-known laudanum user due to his infamous teeth, but he wasn't the only president. The third president, Thomas Jefferson, used the concoction in his later years to treat diarrhea. He only came clean about it on his deathbed when he refused it, saying, "No, doctor, nothing more." There's this idea in society that we all used to be clean as a whistle, and that substance abuse problems didn't happen until recently in human history. But more people in power were on opium and may still be on other substances today. The stresses of being in power, the pain from taking many bullets from outlaws, they'd often resort to opium for their troubles. Usually, these lawmen would be paid handsomely for saving the day, only to spend it all on a friend to numb the pain. Remember, these lawmen were paid handsomely too. Keeping the city safe from bad guys paid off, and that gave them enough money to get their little friends that helped, whether it was a bottle of the substance or a small prick in the arm. That being said, it's once again hard to tell what lawmen and politicians had some kind of monkey on their backs, for if they did have addictions, they usually kept them hidden. So, minus a few politicians and lawmen who are verified to have taken it, it's all up to speculation at the end of the day. One way they may have done so is to have donned a disguise and headed to the opium den. The opium den. When you think of Chinese stores during the Old West, you may think of laundromats or other storefronts that were run by the Chinese, because according to society at that time, a respectable white man would never run them. But one place you may not have heard of was the opium den. Have you ever been to a hookah lounge where you and some friends sit around, sometimes on plush furniture, and smoke from a hookah? Now, imagine if that hookah contained some powerful painkillers that could knock you out if you weren't careful. This was an opium den, and many flocked to such dens for that exact reason. When the Chinese made it to the West, they opened up several opium dens. Once again, the Chinese were seen as people whose work was lower than the white man's, so they were the ones who ran these outfits. Chinese mobsters would supply the opium, but most of the patrons were not Chinese. You would go on, choose an opium pipe, hold it over an oil lamp, and inhale. These dens were frequented by both the rich and the poor. Think of them like hotels. If you were rich, your opium den would be a 5-star experience. You'd have plush furniture, attractive female attendants, and some of the finest opium known to mankind. But if you were poor, your opium den would be like a rundown motel. The pipes may be dirty, the opium laces with who knows what, and there was no service with a smile. At the turn of the 20th century, the law started to crack down on opium dens and narcotics in general, creating a black market. In turn, this led many den users to try black market morphine, which was much more expensive and addictive. This was especially true in Seattle, where more muggings happened due to the addicts trying to find any way they could to fuel their addiction. One 1919 study by the Seattle Health Department revealed that in 2 years, the number of local addicts increased by 150%. There were even reports of pharmaceuticals being broken into, with the contents stolen being rarely money, but their wares. In 1957, the last known opium den was shut down in New York City, but there may be other opium dens hiding somewhere deep in the black market. All of this is happening with the crackdown on such establishments, but where is the help? Is it coming? And did these people want help with their afflictions? No help on the horizon. Many of the men who took morphine regularly knew that there was a problem with it. The morphine would feel great initially, but deep down, many knew that there was no such thing as something this pleasurable with no consequence. The 19th century was still a period where addiction was treated as a moral failing, and someone who had an addiction was treated as someone who refused to have any willpower. Often, these mindsets were rooted in religion and puritanical movements, and while these religious movements, such as the temperance movement, did offer some support networks, they often did so with the implication that you should be ashamed for becoming addicted. And very few people want to be perceived as failures, so they would often hide their addictions the best they could or deny that it was a problem. During this time, you could find many newspapers referring to people who were addicted as morphine fiends, or that you were a slave of the substance you were taking. Being called a fiend or a slave was a dehumanizing way of looking at addiction, so many would just try to toughen it up on their own. Some people, through willpower alone, could beat their addiction, but others may have been fighting with brain biology, which was often the winner. And if you couldn't beat it, you'd often take more and more until you pass away from an overdose. Or you may have taken your own life due to the guilt and shame of it all, with no real help given to you. That being said, there was an increase in our understanding of addiction. The idea that addiction was a disease wasn't something new. In 1784, founding father Benjamin Rush believed that excessive drinking was a disease. During this time, excessive drinking was an issue, and his philosophy would help launch the temperance movement, a movement that may have overcorrected things but had good intentions. In the 1850s, early rehab centers started to appear. These were known as homes for the fallen. They were like the modern-day AA, where instead of detoxifying yourself through medications, you'd meet with other people who had the same issues and work together to reframe your moral character. Some of them, however, were more based on insane asylums, such as the New York State Inebriate Asylum. While a facility like this had good intentions, it probably made many addicts not want to admit they had a problem, as going to what was dubbed the loony bin wasn't the best choice. And during this time, the cure for addiction may have been more dangerous than the substance itself. We all know who Sigmund Freud was. The man had revolutionary ideas about the human mind, but many of his ideas have not aged well. One idea he had? Replacing morphine with another substance. This powdery white substance you may know as blow or snow. It's the type of substance you would snort, the substance that Coca-Cola put in their sodas early on, if you get our drift. He believed this powder to have magical properties and used it to treat addiction to morphine and the bottle. Imagine going to treat an addiction and being told to treat it using a substance that's even more addictive. Eventually, these substances, including liquor, began getting heavily regulated or illegal, and this made it even more difficult for folks to get the help they needed. Many people did not want to admit they had a drinking or opium problem, as they may land behind bars if they said it. Others may have believed that they would get disowned by their families if they admitted to taking these substances. However, as morphine became regulated and the addicts of the past began passing away, this did help curb the crisis. However, if there is one thing you should remember in life, it's that the more things change, the more they stay the same. In the 21st century, our understanding of addiction has evolved quite a bit, and yet we still have many parallels with our past. Many people take something to numb the pain away, and this often causes more harm than good at the end of the day. Many of our modern addictions to painkillers have the exact origins as the addictions in the past. A doctor who wants to make a quick buck will overprescribe painkillers, and people, especially those with addiction genes, will become addicted and abuse their prescription refills. And when that runs out, they will begin looking for any way they can to take the painkillers. Often, the illegal painkiller crises were created through legal means, and while many people are more sympathetic to the addict, there are still many who will judge them as moral failures. Between that, the illegality of these substances, and the extreme cost of rehab, it's made many addicts still live in shame. One hot-button issue over the past few decades is our war on illicit substances. Is this war reducing or perhaps fueling addiction? That is something to think about. War is another way that things have stayed the same. Veterans of wars have many benefits now, but many are still homeless and are dealing with PTSD and addictions. Many of them have long-lasting injuries as well. The bullets may be cleaner, and the doctors are less amputation happy, but the explosions can mangle a body, and the pain never goes away. This is not just the physical pain, but the emotional pain as well. This isn't to say there hasn't been progress. These addictions are treated much more carefully, and modern psychology has made therapy much more therapy. But many people do not have access to these resources. Not only that, but while our quality of life has improved, the 21st century has brought more challenges that have us seeking an escape, even if the escape may lead to the ultimate exit from this earth. It's a lot to think about. With that, we believe we'll end it here. Once again, we appreciate you stopping by. Have you or someone you've known suffered from an addiction? Do you have any ancestors you know have taken these substances? Let us know in the comments below.